Hello, everyone, and I'm terribly, terribly sorry for the delay. It wasn't us; it was Crowdcast, a great big technical outage. But thank you to those of you who have borne with us and have made it to this event this evening. And I think it's going to be a really, really fascinating evening. I hope once we've sort of deflustered ourselves. Just to introduce myself, I'm Tara Garnett, the director at Table and a fellow here at the Oxford Martin School. And I'm joined by three fascinating panelists who I'm going to introduce in a minute. And I think each of these panelists is going to bring a different perspective to the livestock question, which is really the point of this evening. I think everyone here who's going to be listening in on this evening will be aware of the fact that livestock are implicated in a range of social and environmental problems, not least of which, of course, is the problem of climate change. But we all also know that the livestock question, is a very, very complex one. An example of an issue where there's a ton of evidence out there, but a lot of contestation of that evidence, because of it being different kinds of evidence from different disciplines, based on different scales of observation, different contexts, different sets of assumptions, using different methodologies. And it's an area where scientific understanding is fraught, contested. And the upshot of this is that the evidence gets pulled and pushed in different directions and used in all sorts of ways to give different answers to the question of what's the livestock problem and what ought we to do about it. And of course, it's a topic where science interleaves with or is mediated by ethics and values, different ways of deciding what to prioritize and different visions of what we actually want. And this really is the purpose of the evening. It's to try and dig down and explore through this panel discussion why we hold the views we do about livestock and why we have different views and what evidence and values we bring to these discussions. So among our panelists, I hope us to look at where we disagree, but also what points of commonality we might be able to find. So before I go any further and introduce the panelists, just to say some housekeeping notes, it's all going to be recorded. There'll be as much time for questions at the end as we can manage, given that the shortening, we will still have to finish at 6:30. But you can use the Ask a Question button, and you can also vote on the questions that you see, and the highest voting answers will ask. So, on to the panelists. I'm delighted to introduce Dan Rato, who's the Director of Food and Agriculture at the Breakthrough Institute, which is a California think tank which takes, I'd say, a tech-positive approach to ways of addressing our environmental problems. Also, Dr. Pablo Manzano from the Basque Center for Climate Change, who originally a rangeland ecologist, who works now to try and understand livestock and their role within a context of this sort of complexity of social, economic and ecological variables and at different temporal and spatial scales. And finally, Dr. Helena Wright, who's the Policy Director at FAIR. FAIR's the world's fastest growing investor network, which is focusing on the environmental, social and governance risks in the global food sector, particularly those associated with intensive animal agriculture. So I'm going to ask each of you to talk just for a couple of minutes, where really I'd like you to just kind of set out your stall in terms of what you feel the real causes of the livestock problems we face today are, and what your visions of a bad livestock future and a desirable livestock future might look like. So if you just kind of confine your remarks to just a couple of minutes, and then we can go in turns and then open out into a proper discussion. So Helena, please go ahead first.
Great to be here. Hi. So yeah, as Tara mentioned, I'm the policy director at FAIR, and we are an investor network that supports investors to understand the risks in the global food system, with a particular focus actually on animal agriculture. So our research really covers the most material issues such as climate, biodiversity, antibiotics, and so on. And I think in terms of that question of what you see as the the vision of what the future would look like, say coming up to 2050, that's actually a really big issue for investors as well, because a lot of investors have made commitments, say to net zero. A lot of them are trying to address deforestation as well in the supply chain. And when we see this sector, there isn't a clear enough roadmap for what we need to see actually to get to 2050. We have seen in other sectors, for example, the IEA's net zero roadmap was very influential in really showing what we need to see by 2050 and kind of outlining for the energy sector what would the milestones might need to be for different stakeholders, for different companies. And that really helped the energy sector to understand the transition that would be needed for 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, we don't have any equivalent to that sort of IEA net zero roadmap for agriculture and food systems at the moment. We don't really have that globally agreed kind of clarity for a central roadmap. So there are different studies out there sort of showing how we, meet various goals, climate, nature, and food security, but people are not sort of putting those goals together and looking across multiple sustainable development goals. And that's really what's needed, I think, because there's a lot of different trade-offs. We know that the demand for protein is growing. We know that the demand for land is growing. And all of these different pressures will be increasing over the next decades. So I think what we need is greater clarity to how to reconcile these multiple issues, the sustainability risks and the planetary boundaries that we face, planetary boundaries on land, on pesticide use, etc. We're not sort of meeting the goals at the moment that would lead us to a more sustainable world that would actually be sustainable over the future. So yes, what many investors have mentioned is that we need a clearer roadmap, and that would probably be some combination of regenerative approaches for agroecology, some combination of diet shifts, including alternative and plant-based protein sources, and then some combination of intensification in the mix as well, different pathways, and we need more clarity on what that looks like. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Helena. Dan, would you like to go next?
Thank you. As you introduced, I'm Dan Rato. I'm the Director of Food and Agriculture at the Breakthrough Institute. And I'd like to zoom out a little bit to talk about those other SDGs actually that Helena mentioned. Livestock is not just an environmental problem, it's also interwoven with a bunch of human development problems. There are hundreds of millions of people in the world who get much of their income and livelihoods from raising livestock, as well as certainly billions who rely on meat, milk, and other products for protein, calories, micronutrients, and other elements of nutrition. Although I think it's really easy to kind of have a very kind of Western perspective and to focus on, the US where I am or the UK where I think many of you are. Many people around the world, like an estimated billion or so, do suffer from protein deficiencies. And so there's a real case to be made that we do need more access to livestock products in much of the world, as well as Helena mentioned, probably less meat consumption in places like the US, where we consume far above the global average. And I think, in addition to these human problems that we face, on the environmental side, of course, livestock do contribute something on the order of 14 to 19% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We can quibble over the numbers, but it's a substantial amount. And of course, contribute to dramatic land use conversion from forests to pasture and to cropland, as well as a number of other impacts. I think we probably intuitively understand many of the drivers or the root causes of this. Certainly, global population is large, demand has been rising, meat demand has doubled or so since 1960 per capita. But one element I think that's often lost is something that Helena alluded to, which is the low productivity of livestock agriculture in many parts of the world. In many places, the yields per cow and the environmental impacts per cow or per kilogram of beef are much larger, 5 times or 10 times larger than they are in much of the Western world and in the highest productivity countries. So what I would really emphasize is that need to intensify livestock agriculture more in the coming decades so that the lowest productivity places can raise yields, not just reducing environmental impacts, but also providing more access to protein, greater profits for livestock producers, and otherwise helping enhance both human welfare as well as environmental welfare.
Thank you, Dan. Pablo, over to you. I suspect you might offer a slightly different take on the issues.
Yes. Thank you, Tara. Well, I'm Pablo Manzano. I'm an ecologist working at the Past Center of Climate Change BC3. And I think my perspective is pretty much oriented by my ecologist background. When we analyze the grazing systems in the world, and I am specialized in grazing systems, both by wild and by domestic livestock, we can see that in Europe and in the States and in many developed countries, particularly, we have a lack of herbivory that is causing a lot of environmental problems. And I think that's very descriptive of the evolution that the livestock sector has had in the last decades, where we detect both a decrease in the mobility of livestock, which has contributed a lot to decrease the productivity of the systems. They don't imitate anymore the wild herbivore systems with a certain degree of mobility that basically follow the productivity of the plants, but just stay sedentary and food has to be brought to them. And also we detect an increasing industrialization of the production. And I think that causes artifacts in the data that many people may sort of in the wrong way. For example, much of the footprint that is attributed to livestock, like this number from FAO that is quoted very often of the 14.5% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions triggered by livestock, should be nuanced, because it is not being accounted that in many of the marginal lands that Dan was just talking about that are perceived to be really unproductive or of low productivity, these are lands that cannot be used for any other use, that can just be used by livestock because livestock is mobile. For example, in the center of the Sahara, you can use livestock to graze on the annual plants that grow there when one of these rains that happens every 7 years happen, because you just take the livestock there, and you cannot do that with plants and seeds, of course, because they're sessile organisms. They are not mobile. So it means, in all this, it means that for me, the crisis of the livestock sector right now is very much linked to an industrialization that, as with so many other aspects of our current life, is really a drug addict of fossil fuels. And we are not going back to these livestock practices that depend less on fossil fuels and that are ecological proxies or ecological analogies to what wild herbivores would do. And also we have to look at the paleontology. We know that for the last 12 to 15 million years, herbivory has been a force shaping ecosystems all over the world, and only in the last tens of thousands of years we have lost most of the herbivores worldwide. And there are processes triggered by humans, like, for example, burning by hunter-gatherers, or also the landscape management that pastoralists do, that substitute these functions. So we have the absurd situation now that, for example, in Europe, where you have a loss of biodiversity because you lose all the open ecosystems, yet you are arguing about the high environmental footprint in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of those herbivores that we are losing and that we shouldn't lose anymore, and whose methane, for example, will be emitted either by deer or also by wild fires that we are having both in California, in Australia, in the Mediterranean.
Thank you. I mean, Dan, would you like to come back on that? I mean, I'm seeing a sort of slightly different set of visions, and I'm wondering whether this is because of different contexts or whether it's just fundamentally different ideas of what the priorities are for the food system, different kinds of metrics. And I think also we haven't quite defined intensification and industrialization. So perhaps you can start by offering your definition of that, and then come back at Pablo, and also what you agree with him about, as well as what you disagree with him.
Certainly. So I think it is really important to understand that livestock intensification is not the same necessarily as industrialization. In short, livestock can be intensified, livestock production can be intensified without necessarily mirroring the confined animal feeding operations, or sometimes called factory farms, more by activists, that we have in the US and in much of the industrialized world. Intensification can include many different things that enhance the amount of production per hectare or per animal. It can mean better pasture management. It can mean, as Pablo was saying, really trying to align the grazing patterns of animals with the productivity of the ecosystem, with the productivity of the forages and grasses, so that it's really optimally used. It can also mean providing more crop-based feeds to animals. I think that's an area where we'll probably disagree, but grain-based or corn, soy based feeds can provide much more energy to animals and help them basically gain weight quicker. And intensification can also mean things that we all, I think, want to see, such as better veterinary care and better reproductive health, so that animals get sick less often. Fewer calves are lost during basically birthing, so that overall, as much of the energy really going into the system ends up going out as meat, as milk, and other products that people want to produce. Now, these benefits that we see of intensification, I think, are also seen with CAFOs. And I think that's a very uncomfortable point, that there are some environmental benefits, certainly with this more industrialized, energy intensive, and yes, fossil fuel dependent system. Certainly shifting over to grain-based, more confined operations reduces overall land use, although it does involve some more cropland use. Definitely reduces the pressure on pasture, the pressure to increase pasture land into either forests or other types of vegetation. And by almost every study I've seen, it reduces the amount of total greenhouse gas emissions per pound of beef or per pound of milk. There are definitely trade-offs, though. I personally go back and forth over whether I value the environmental benefits of CAFOs more than I value the animal welfare benefits of more grass-fed systems. And certainly there are human labor trade-offs as well, where workers in meat processing plants and workers on feedlots are not necessarily treated very well. So I don't think there's any silver bullet necessarily, or one size fits all solution. I think these are trade-offs that people will make depending on their values and depending on the local priorities. In some places, intensifying to the level of a CAFO may make sense. In others, it very well may not. But that all said, I do want to just emphasize a couple points Pablo made, because I think they're really important and people often downplay them. So one is this issue of methane emissions from wildlife. I think that's definitely true, that if we remove cattle or sheep or other livestock from an ecosystem and restore it to some past version of that ecosystem with wildlife, there will be some amount of methane emissions from those animals as well, from deer, from bison. Every estimate I've seen suggests that it's substantially smaller, that level of emissions, but it does certainly offset a part of the greenhouse gas benefits that we might imagine. And I guess just one last point where maybe we kind of all perhaps disagree to some degree. amount is the role of, I guess, grass-fed production systems. I think that certainly, as Pablo mentioned, grazing cattle on pasture, in forage lands, in range lands can be really important. At the same time, the level, with growing meat demand and the extremely high level of meat demand we have in some places, we just simply wouldn't be able to meet existing demand exclusively with grass-fed systems. It would substantially increase meat prices. It's certainly true in the US. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but I think that that's a real trade-off we have to grapple with.
Thanks, Dan. I think that's almost starting to lead on into a discussion about consumption side things, but I'd like to bring in Helena first, because I think Pablo comes from quite a sort of bottom-up perspective, involving people who may or may not be so closely connected to the kind of global financial system, whereas you look at this from a very, very macro scale, looking at working with your investors. And I think in a way you kind of straddle both Pablo and Dan, insofar as Dan's vision of the kind of the CAFO and the intensification as a way to go is something that you are highlighting as a kind of rife with a whole load of risks on one hand, and on the other, Pablo's vision of a sort of smaller scale agroecological approach is perhaps not within the purview of the people that you work with. But I'm putting words into your mouth, so perhaps you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting debate, and I think just actually first off, I just want to say that we need to draw a huge distinction between the huge industrial CAFOs that we see in intensive livestock production, primarily going to the rich sort of global north consumption level, and the smallholders, which are, primarily sort of tending to their livelihoods and in fact most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change rather than causing climate change themselves. So I think just to put that there, the Lancet report, provides a science-based approach that says that in the global north, actually, the animal protein consumption is too high and would need to be reduced to meet planetary boundaries, whereas in the global south, in many places, there may be room to increase that. So just to put that out there at the beginning, I wanted to touch on some of the issues that Dan had raised actually most distinctly and kind of offer a perspective. One is the greenhouse gas efficiency per unit, which has been used as a variable. But I think from the investor perspective, you really cannot just look at greenhouse gases. That's extremely important, because if you only look from a carbon perspective, you could lead to very perverse incentives, say for biodiversity, for antibiotics, and for a whole other host level of risks if you were to intensify production only focusing on greenhouse gas per unit. Secondly, it hasn't worked very well for the fossil fuel sector. So there's a parallel there. Efficiency of fossil fuel extraction obviously was something that the fossil fuel industrial sector promoted a lot, thinking that that would reduce emissions. But the efficiency of fossil fuel per unit obviously leads to greater use of fossil fuels and greater extraction. So I would say fundamentally that is a parallel that we need to draw on. Perhaps we need more research on that, I think, because we don't have enough information about how greenhouse gas efficiency per unit may not reduce global emissions if you look at it from a livestock perspective, as well as the other ESG risks that are involved. So that could be an interesting area for future research in how the perverse incentives could occur. And then another issue is that you mentioned using less land in some of the most intensive systems, but actually, I think there's an issue there of the animal feed production, which goes into that, because yes, per land unit, it may be if animals are more intensively produced, they would use less land. But as we know, biodiversity is a huge issue, and our FAIR sort of research shows that a huge number of the protein producers, over 70%, are not tracking whether they are causing deforestation down their supply chain. So we don't have the data, unfortunately, at the moment. We literally don't have the data to know about the animal feed and how that could be causing deforestation. As we know that, a huge amount of global soya production, around 70%, goes to livestock, and we don't know, how that's causing deforestation. So we are lacking the data to understand these issues as well. And the final part I'd just like to mention, looking from an investor perspective, you can really reduce a whole host of risks by looking more into diversification into sustainable protein. And that is something that now a lot of companies are doing and a lot of investors are looking at. And that means plant-based meat alternative products, which primarily feed that, the growing demand levels. And alternative protein can also mean sort of very simple products ranging from, bean burgers, lentil burgers, etc., to more kind of processed products. But whichever products they are, they do have a range of environmental benefits, actually, because they reduce not just climate risk, but also biodiversity risk, antibiotic risk, land use, etc. So I think there is a role for that. And a lot of companies we sell, even the large sort of protein producers, are looking at that issue, although we haven't seen enough awareness of policymakers right now. So policy is the third sort of point that I would like to raise. Intensive systems that we have are hugely reliant on agricultural subsidies. So while they may look efficient, they actually are economically inefficient and a sort of inefficient way to produce protein. So that is an area which I think may require greater understanding and greater information.
Thank you, Helena. Pablo, I just was hoping you would kind of respond to Helena, because on the one hand, we have this concept of the alternative, more sustainable protein, which is often the focus of investment by these big, large-scale, CAFO-linked animal protein producers, who are the kind of the antithesis of the systems that you're promoting. So I'm just wondering what your take is on this. And I think it would also be quite useful to kind of zoom out into a larger discussion about what we mean by dietary change, its potentials and the limitations.
Yeah, well, I wanted to agree with Helena that, policies actually orient how the private sector acts. And that's very important. And I think even if more could be done from the side of policy, the fact that these initiatives for alternative protein sources and like plant-based meat and all that stuff comes into place is also from the demand of the consumers, but also from the demand of policymakers. And I also wanted to agree with Dan that intensification in general, in many aspects, is something good. And the fact that, for example, less calves and less lambs die now that 100 years ago, which is a way of intensification. Of course, that's good for providing more food, for providing more protein for people that, for example, I've worked 10 years in Africa, and I know that half of the African population is considered to be stunted because of insufficient access to animal source food. So it's a big issue. But I think here what we have is a set of assumptions that even if they are in the mainstream, I consider them to be wrong, directly wrong. For example, the land use change, and this is an aspect that you both have mentioned. It is considered that any land used by livestock is land used by humans, and therefore it's land that is negatively used. However, from the side of the ecology and from the side of the evidence from biodiversity, we know that for grazed ecosystems, which are basically all except for rainforests, at least since 15 million years ago. A moderate herbivory mediated either by wild herbivores or by domestic herbivores is positive. It's not neutral, it's positive in terms of ecosystem function and in terms of biodiversity. However, it is also very important to define how it is used. Of course, it's not the same if you have a herd of cows grazing all year long in a grass lawn, because it would be the same effect as if you're mowing your grass every day. Of course, you will kill the plants. You will need to graze them and then let them rest, and then graze them again and let them rest, just as you would do in your garden lawn. It's the same. And then you would produce a landscape, which is the natural landscape that we would have see in the last interglacial, in the Ionian, which had a similar climate as now, but with way more herbivores all over the place, where we would have a mixture of trees, shrubs, and a lot of grass, much more than we imagine. And I think that's the misconception, that outside the small world of the vegetation ecologists that I belong to is massively misunderstood in the world. For example, the Cerrado or the Chaco, which I happen to have been working with communities in the Chaco region in South America for the last 10 years. It is interpreted that it's the livestock that is deforesting the Chaco, but actually it is the livestock keepers in the Chaco that are uniting themselves against the deforesters, which, guess what, are the grain producers, the soybean producers and the maize producers, that are actually not really triggering deforestation as we imagine, of a closed forest that turns into a pasture, but rather a savanna. The Chaco and the Cerrado are described as a savanna already by Enrique Bucher in 1984. It's turning that into a cropland, and it's a cropland to produce soybean oil, which is used mainly for human production, but with a very valuable co-product, which is the soybean cake, which is fed to basically monogastrics, that is, not to ruminants, but to chicken and to pork. So it's this grain fraction that makes this intensification possible, that is actually creating a lot of this land use change, negative land use change. And also you mentioned, you mentioned also the existing demand, that we have to cope with the existing demand. In my opinion, that shouldn't be an issue, because, you know, I think we should aim to produce as sustainable as possible, and then we should just adjust the demand to the offer that we have on sustainable production, which I believe is much more than we think, because of the reasons that I am highlighting in this talk. And also a very important issue that you mentioned is that all the estimates that you have read, and I'm sure you are right that you have read all these estimates, say that there is much more livestock than wild herbivores there should be. But this is a very interesting subject that I happen also to know personally, because I know the persons implicated in that. This was formulated by Anthony Barnowski in a publication in PNAS in 2008. And a friend of Dr. Barnowski happens to be a collaborator of mine at the University of Helsinki, where I have performed a postdoc during the last 2 years. And he told me that Barnowski talks about that. It was just a calculation on the back of an envelope to trigger the debate. But unfortunately, there has been no debate. So people have just taken the numbers that Barnowski published on PNAS, and they haven't discussed them further. For example, the revision that Baron et al. In PNAS 3 years ago that they published, they just took directly the numbers from Barnowski. And I have a paper submitted now that hopefully will be published soon, where I contest these numbers with some newer numbers that have been published. But for example, you have a very recent publication in Journal of Applied Ecology. The first author, I'm not good with Danish names, but it's like Flokgaard or something like that. But it's from the lab of Dr. Svenning, who is very known for these things, Jens Svenning. And they have actually seen what the natural or the seemingly natural densities of herbivores are in protected areas in all the continents. And even if it's a not very refined work, because they have done a global work and they have taken just the data that they could, they show that in Africa and in Asia, where you have complete guilds of herbivores, you have elephants, you have lots of antelopes, you have browsers, you have grazers, and not only browsers, because in Europe and in the States, we have lost most of the grazers. We only have browsers. And you have really high densities of herbivores, really high, I mean, much more than what we are imagining now. And it's true that in other continents, these densities are lower. But it's also true that in other continents, animals are not able to migrate as they used to. And I'm personally doing a research right now in Spain on that. And in Spain, we are having really troubles to find a natural protected area where we can observe migration, because, you know, as all developed countries, it is so fragmented by roads, by croplands, etc., that it's impossible to have a Serengeti, so to say. Okay, but we have a national park in central Spain, where it's because of the alignment of the mountain ranges, and also because it used to be a hunting area, so they reserve some very productive area, not for croplands, but to have animals there, where we observe these kind of migrations. And even if we are talking just about red deer, because we have lost all grazers, and the red deer are browsers, we are observing a density of deer that is about half what we would get in an extensive livestock system. Okay. So yeah.
So I think
and
that's...
no, and just a last point, Tara. Sorry, I also wanted to say that in my experience in Africa, also development agencies are not very realistic in terms of implementing CAFOs in rural areas in Africa, for example, because it's also not understood that the communities there cannot enter capital-intensive economic strategies. And this is also, like from the social point of view, it's also an advantage of the extensive livestock systems that they are not capital-intensive. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time, and that we started a little bit late, and I'd also like to move on to the discussion of the COP and the needs for the future COP. But before doing so, I'd just like to kind of go back to this question of consumption and trying to link it a little bit more with values as well, and with what we as kind of individuals or as researchers feel to be a good system and a good future and a feasible future. So just so one of the points, that sort of the obvious point, is that, you know, our population globally is now largely urban and is going to be more and more urban over time, and I think we have several kind of some visions going on here. One is, to be very, very crude about it, which is that people want to eat meat, give them cleaner meat. Another vision is people want to eat meat, give them decent substitutes. And a third vision, which was give people want meat, it's right and proper, but their appetite should adjust to the kind of ecological kind of carrying capacity. And I think those are kind of some very common sets of discussions that we have that are never quite resolved. But have I understood you correctly? And in terms of how that feeds into policy making and into ideas about what a way forward is and what's both desirable and what's feasible, I'd be really, really interested if you could reflect upon this, not just from the perspective of the evidence you marshal, but also about your own personal visions of what you would like things to be like going forward, and how far removed that is from what you see to be likely. So who would like to go first? Dan, go ahead.
I can jump in briefly. I think from my perspective, what matters most with regards to consumption is how policies are really designed, or how efforts are designed to change other people's consumption and behavior. I think that the actual point of intervention, whether it's a subsidy or a tax or mandate or regulation or educational campaign, that to me is really the crux of the issue, more so than what ultimate level of consumption we're trying to achieve. And from my perspective, what there seems to be the most interested in and really strong evidence for, from what we've learned from trying to cut greenhouse gas emissions and improve environmental impacts in other sectors, what really seems important is to really try to make low carbon or really clean meat cheap, to make more sustainable meat cheap, whether that's animal-based or plant-based, whether that's grass-fed or not. Ultimately, I think any effort that is focused on making products more expensive, taxing it, or mandating some maximum level of consumption, banning meat on Fridays, for instance, or something along those lines, is going to inevitably run into really insurmountable political obstacles in most countries. Perhaps not in all, but I think in most in most European countries as well as in the US. And I think that political element is something that we all need to take really seriously, because ultimately we don't want to pursue, I think, pipe dreams for policies that may on paper, on a spreadsheet, seem optimal, but ultimately in the public sphere are not going to get their time of day.
Thank you. Helena, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think, yeah, this is a really interesting discussion, but no, yeah, I agree. I think it's probably some kind of version of that, but I would say that in terms of that definition of clean meat, that's not really sort of terminology that I'm familiar with in terms of a sort of definition. But I do think what we're seeing is a kind of diversification into the non-animal protein as a way to reduce risk. And I do think there is a role also for the regenerative agricultural systems as well, because we've seen obviously various studies, and Pablo mentioned some of them. In the more extensive systems, there is obviously benefits there, but there's a big difference between the extensive and the intensive systems. The only issue with that, some of the focus now on regenerative agriculture, which has been kind of, you know, held up a lot and pushed within the policy space, is that that does actually use a lot more land as well. So the Roundtree and et al. Sort of study and others kind of show that the land intensity of the regenerative agricultural systems is higher. So it's not sort of a silver bullet solution which people can promote essentially for those reasons. So I think in that case it is definitely a combination of the two. And what was quite interesting was I thought the UK's National Food Strategy, which obviously was a proposal which hasn't been accepted into policy, but that had sort of around sort of 1/3 of sort of alternative proteins, sort of around 1/3 of regenerative agriculture, and some intensification in there. And sort of the combination of the three areas seems to have a lot of understanding of the different trade-offs between climate, biodiversity, and so on. But I mean, within that system, there's a radical transformation needed to get to the system where we are now, to a more sustainable system. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
And so I'm going to come back to you on that, because I think that will lead very well onto the COP. But I mean, I think Pablo, perhaps you could offer your response, but also sort of tie it into what you feel is needed in the next few months as we move towards COP27, and also what you feel the role to be of the different kind of stakeholders, from sort of policymakers to civil society to industry, in thinking about how to move forward.
Yeah, I wanted to reflect on the demand point, because I think the fact that prices go up, meat prices go up if we bet for sustainable meat or for sustainable animal products, milk and others, is not necessarily bad, because we have a crisis worldwide, and not only in developed countries where we have a massive problem of depopulation, but also in developing countries. For the prices paid for to my criterion, sustainable production of animal products, which involves pastoralists. Many of them, by the way, doing regenerative grazing without knowing, because that's more of a thing of developed countries. The consideration, I mean, whereas the techniques are pretty common, it's adaptive grazing and etc. I don't think it is really a problem that the prices go up, as long as in the states, in the different countries, we have redistribution mechanisms that allow poor people to access to a healthy level of animal source products of sustainable origin. But an increase in prices is something that would contribute to reduce poverty in very marginal areas that have no other options of human development and of livelihoods, and that are now experiencing a crisis because of the unfair competition by more industrial ways of production that actually achieve cheap products that are made available everywhere through globalization, and that push them out of their economic sustainability, I would say, and of their social sustainability. And much of it explains a lot of the crises that we are seeing, you know, even related to maybe you will think I am exaggerating, but this is also an area that I'm working on right now. The whole crisis on terrorism in the Sahel and all the problems of insecurity are pretty much related with a lack of access to social services and lack of getting enough income in these communities. And usually the move towards violence and towards insecurity is triggered by this insufficient income that maybe not lead to hunger, but leads to social crises, like inside their communities to access marriage and other things. So I do think that we have win-win solutions in this field. But in that sense, and concretely on the question that you asked, Tara, what I would like the COP to host is a revision on how these impacts are evaluated, so that sustainable livestock systems are better evaluated. Because I think right now it's not done in a multi-sectoral way, it's not done in a multidisciplinary way, and it's not, you know, nobody is considering the factors that I am discussing here, and that may cause policy actions and evolutions of the sector that may be counterproducing for tackling climate change. So that's something that the IPCC and also the parties of the COP should take really seriously, and they're not taking it seriously right now, and that worries me. That worries me a lot.
Thank you, Dan. Would you what would be your sort of wish list for the COP, and how different or how similar is it? I mean, what do you agree with that Pablo said, and what would you add or challenge?
So on the note of the next COP, I think there are a number of successes from the previous one that can be built upon. So in COP26, or really right around it, a number of countries, I believe 30 or so, signed on together to commit more funding to research and development in agriculture to help with climate smart innovation. And I think there are a number of areas in livestock production where we could substantially reduce environmental impacts, in particular methane emissions from industrialized systems in the US and UK and Western Europe and elsewhere, through new technologies, through things like feed additives or supplements that reduce the methane that come out of from cow burps. There are potentially vaccines that can be developed to reduce methane emissions, new breeding programs. There's a huge need here for more research. And particularly, that's true outside of industrialized countries as well. We talked about the importance of intensification. A lot of that comes from improved research, applied research, as well as education and extension programs. So I would love to see a huge ramp up in funding commitments for something like that. That's probably the primary thing. I think I want to, I guess, clarify something that perhaps Pablo and I seem to disagree about, which is this role of prices. I certainly think that higher livestock prices that are really market driven are certainly really beneficial for livestock producers. That's true really throughout agriculture. It's true for crop producers as well. But I do think that artificially applied increases the price, whether it's a tax on the at the consumer end at retail, or a tax at the supplier end. For instance, people have thrown around the idea of like a carbon tax on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. That unnecessarily places financial burden on producers. It doesn't necessarily increase the market price that they're getting. So that's a real differentiation I want to make there. And similarly, really trying to make these products cheaper, I think a lot of it can come from providing financial support for producers to adopt evidence-based, environmentally beneficial practices, whether in some cases that's more regenerative grazing or adaptive management, it goes by many different names, or whether it's these feed additives I mentioned that sometimes called deburping pills that cut the methane emissions from cows.
Thank you, thank you. And Helena, I mean, I think you must be really sort of gearing up. So what's on your wish list, and what do you feel the role of investors is in trying to shift towards a more sort of sustainable food system?
So I think it was really interesting to see at the last COP26, actually, fossil fuels really came to the fore, and also fossil fuel subsidies as well as an important issue that a lot of governments are focused on. And I think what could be interesting now is for agricultural subsidies to receive similar weight, actually, as there's been a lot of discussion showing how many subsidies there are globally and how negative they are for biodiversity, etc. I think that would be quite a big topic. And some of our investors recently also signed a statement calling on the EU to better align its agricultural subsidies with both climate and nature, since the investors are trying to kind of meet their own goals, but they cannot do this without policy action, sort of actually putting the right measures in place to flow towards a more sustainable system. So that would be interesting to see that receiving a similar weight as it is. We have more than 400 billion agricultural subsidies, and the UN, etc., have released reports saying how unsustainable most of those subsidies are. So I think there are primarily a lot of these subsidies artificially lowering the prices of the more unsustainable products. So they're almost going to the opposite of what we need to see actually right now. So perhaps that's something we could all agree. And the other question I'd like to raise is, you know, this intensification as well. I think, as Pablo mentioned, there's been a lot of use of sort of public funds, including development funds, with the assumption that intensification would create a better system. Sometimes it has also displaced livelihoods and jobs as well as creating, you know, products. So I think there's a big difference between the producers and the consumers. And in terms of the methane topic, just a slightly different perspective there as well. I think that, you know, obviously some of these solutions which are kind of within the same system, kind of incremental solutions can also lower methane emissions as well. But I would also say that another way to reduce methane emissions is a more kind of systemic solution, such as a shift to a more plant-rich and sustainable protein diversification within portfolios, because that is another way that will fundamentally reduce methane emissions as well. So it will be really interesting to see how the methane pledges are taken forwards. At the moment, only energy has received attention really within the methane debate. Hardly a word in about agricultural methane, even though, as the IEA released this week, agriculture is the largest source of methane emissions globally. So I think there's going to have to be more focus on that if we're going to reach the 1.5 goal. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'm very mindful of the fact that we've got a pile of questions that are from the audience, and I'd like to come on to these in a minute. But before I do that, I think it will be really helpful for each of you to kind of take stock and say, is there anything that you've heard from the other speakers that either you agree with or that has modified your opinion, and where do you feel kind of further entrenched in your viewpoints, or where do you continue to disagree? I would just like to try and get you to kind of reach across and see what have you heard where you may have nuanced your point of view. I mean, who would like to kick off first? And if you haven't changed your mind at all, then that's very predictable, but you know.
I probably
I'm not sure.
Helena
have to start. Yeah, I did kind of agree with the point from Dan that better animal welfare is a kind of win-win. So I guess from that, it's like, what do we define as welfare? Because it seems to reduce emissions. So that would be sort of what we define in that, within that term. And then I did also very much agree with Pablo mentioning that the food security issue is a security issue as well, broadly, more than just a food issue. And I think that's really important to consider, because a lot of investors are understanding the financial stability risks related to the unsustainable food system and how it affects loads of different issues. But I think not enough policymakers are aware of how food unsustainable issues are a severe financial stability risk as well as a security risk.
Thank you. Pablo, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, not that I've changed my mind, but I have changed my perception maybe on the arguments of intensification, because I am happy that when people talk about intensification, they talk about improvement in production that involves, real improvements within a food system, and not switching to a more industrial or to a more confined system, like what we were discussing about improved range and soil management, or about improved veterinary care, etc. And I also I'm happy to see that we also agree on, on the shortcomings of, for example, subsidies that are very often oriented to productivity. And this is, even if there is a change in it, but it's a very slow change in the common agricultural policy, from productivity that has actually stimulated more industrial ways of producing towards more environmental aspects. And I think that's good, And ultimately, I think also that the hike in fossil fuel prices that we are going to see because of scarcity of fossil fuels is also going to put things in place, and is going to make fossil fuel intense animal production more expensive than the ways of animal production that are more that are less dependent to it. However, I must continue to disagree on the strategies for reducing methane emission in agriculture, because it's not only that most of the methane is produced by the most extensive productions that are more similar to wild herbivores, but it is also, and we tend to forget it completely, that global warming is not only greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas effect from the gases, but it's also an albedo element. And there is also comprehensive literature showing that a switch from savannas to forests in subtropical areas, not in tropical areas, but in subtropical areas, and also in more temperate and boreal areas, is going to cause a change in the albedo, a negative change in the albedo in terms of absorbing more energy, and it is likely to worsen climate change. I keep on being pretty convinced that we shouldn't touch the pastoralist systems.
Okay, well, Dan, how about you give your last words, and then we'll move on to some questions, however many we can squeeze in.
Sure. I'm increasingly convinced by Pablo's perspective and a perspective about the ecological benefits of grazing. I remain, I think, continue to hold very strong beliefs that there are many problems caused by poor grazing around the world, and I think that can often be lost when we talk about grazing as being beneficial. I think we need to be really nuanced and specific in these discussions. And also, I absolutely agree both with Helena and Pablo about what they would like to see in the next COP. I think we really do need to see a lot more analysis about the role of agriculture in methane emissions, but also for that analysis to be to really take seriously these critiques that Pablo and others are making about the total system-wide effects of removing livestock from the landscape. How much of those emissions might be replaced by wildlife emissions? What will be the effects on ecosystems, on soil carbon, on albedo? Those are all really important to consider, and I wouldn't want to see countries make hasty decisions about how to meet their methane pledge through agriculture without really taking that more holistic approach.
Well, thank you for that. So just some questions. I think we've got, there's a ton of questions here. One of them is I think it's actually been more or less addressed, but so perhaps you could be very quick about it. But beef tends to grab most of the attention, discussion of environmental impacts, but could speakers comment on what they see as the role of other livestock, sheep, goats, pigs, poultry, in a sustainable future food system? Yeah, I mean, Pablo, could you say something about the poultry issue? Because I know you know that there is this kind of, depending on who you talk to, poultry good or poultry bad, depending on which metric you use. Do you see a positive role for poultry and pig production?
Well, rescuing the last comment of Dan, I think it is important to nuance every discourse. And I don't think all grazing livestock is good, because it depends on how you manage that grazing livestock, definitely. And I'm happy to see that this is part of the intensification to manage it better. And with poultry, it's the same with poultry or with pigs, because in my mind, the big distinction is between monogastrics, that is pigs and poultry, and ruminants, which is goats, sheep, cows, yaks, camels, etc. I think both pigs and poultry have a tremendous potential, and also some fish cultures in recycling waste, and we shouldn't forget that. And I am also personally working on pastoralist systems based on pigs, which are the great forgotten side of pastoralist systems, usually linked to forests. I'm preparing also a paper on that. But regarding the chicken, I think they are, or the poultry, I think they're very useful at the backyard level. To use waste to increase circularity of the economy, and that should not be forgotten. However, when you enter into a dynamic of more industrial facilities, this is when the problems start. Also, because of a matter of density of waste, of excreta of the chicken. When you have what we talk about in our research group, livestock keeping that is linked to the territory, no matter if it's ruminants or if it's monogastrics, usually the environmental impacts are much less. And I think the link to the territory would also include ways of raising poultry and pigs that take advantage of the waste, and that do not produce humongous quantities of animals that will cause a lot of problems with the excreta, as we are seeing right now in many countries. Especially, I think, for pigs, but also poultry is a problem for that.
Thank you. I have a question here that is probably well addressed to Helena, actually. It's about, it goes like this. Some of the plant-based foods are high in fat, sugar, and or salt, and highly processed and not in line with a healthy, sustainable diet. So how do you see this fitting into the goal of shifting towards sustainable proteins, where there may be a trade-off between the sort of the carbon footprint, however you might want to measure that, and the health agenda?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that needs further research, actually, as well, because I mean, there is a wide range of different definitions of the non-animal protein products, a really, really wide range. So it could mean anything. Alternative protein could really mean anything from sort of lentil, bean burgers, very simple, right the way to more processed or more salt intensive products. So I think there is a role for the investors to call for better nutrition as well in the products that are being produced, and to make sure that the nutritional aspect is looked at as well. Because obviously what a lot of companies are doing are just responding to consumer demand, and everybody likes the taste of salt, and so I think that's an interesting point. But we also know that a lot of processed meat products are also linked to health issues as well. So if it's sort of replacing one with another, I'm not sure, actually it could be beneficial as well. So it's very complex, and I would say that it requires a lot more research in terms of improving the products that are being produced at the moment, and making sure that nutritional wins are gained as well as the environmental wins that are gained as well.
And do you think that within the investment sector, is nutritional health seen at all as an issue that is associated with risk?
Definitely, I think it's rising up the agenda, definitely, because it's become a lot more on the agenda and the focus is there. So I think a lot of these new ESG frameworks now are sort of being developed for the newer products. What is happening is that there's a lot of new products coming to market, and sometimes it's harder for the data to be made available as well. So I think we'll see an increased focus on that as the sector develops, really.
Thank you. I have a general question. I mean, I don't know who wants to pick this one up. COP27 is billed by Egypt as the Africa COP. Please could speakers comment on the different challenges in achieving sustainability facing livestock farmers in African developing countries and industrial economies? I mean, I think we touched upon this in our conversation just now, but perhaps you could expand on it a bit. Dan, would you like to have a go?
I think, honestly, I'll make the comments brief. I'm really curious to hear what Pablo has to say about this, given his experience working in Africa. I have not worked in Africa, but based on my work, one of the top challenges and really opportunities is really investing in agricultural productivity in much of Africa. There are some countries, certainly South Africa in particular, that already have highly developed, highly productive agricultural systems, but in many parts of the continent, there are very large yield gaps between what farmers could be producing, what they currently are, due to limited availability of fertilizers and irrigation and water, and likewise in livestock. There's a lot of potential to substantially increase productivity. I think one aspect of this too that's really important to consider is how to really future-proof these agricultural production systems, how to make sure that the changes that countries, companies, and other people are investing in today help people become more resilient to the projected increases in warming, changes in water availability, changes in pest pressures.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dan. And I think Africa also has an immense challenge in terms of population pressure, because it has to give a lot of food to a lot of people that are coming, because it has very, very high fertility rates. And it also has a lot of way to go in terms of improvements and in terms of what I consider the good side of intensification, because since the independence of most of African countries in the 60s, you can trace the extension services, how they have been falling apart basically, and how there has not been enough investment in that. And there is a huge need of investment in those extension services. I think it's not necessary to switch the production systems, the local production systems, from the agroecological systems that are dominating now into more industrial ones. I don't think at all that this is necessary, but they do need a lot of extension services, much more than now. And it's also interesting to live in Africa and to see how the new technologies are expanding very fast, for example, with mobile phones, and to see what the immense potential it would be, for example, for pastoralists, again, to provide them with extension services to measure some parameters of the animals by remote means, and that nobody is doing that so far is a little bit sad, you know. So I think there is a lot of potential, but also probably African governments need to listen much more to what is happening within the communities themselves, because there is a lot of innovation going on that very often gets uncaptured because nobody is listening to it.
What kind of innovation?
Well, for example, I don't know if you can do that in Great Britain, but in Spain you can already pay with the mobile phone, okay, in shops and so on. Well, this is a Kenyan invention. This started with M-Pesa, mobile Pesa. Pesa means money in Swahili. And this was a Kenyan guy that came with the idea because they were sending airtime to remote family members in the countryside, just to pay for things, and an informal economy developed on that. So they formalized that I started paying with M-Pesa 12 years ago when I moved to Kenya. So, and that's something that where the South has exported solutions to the North, to the global North, but there are many more things like that, and for example, it's interesting because in many African countries you have not had a development of landline telephones. They have jumped directly from nobody having a telephone to everybody having a mobile telephone, a mobile. So I mean, it's difficult to give examples right now, but for example, in terms of extensions, instead of market management, I also worked on the Ngorongoro region, and you saw their very smart strategies to maximize the price of the animals and get the most of it by just doing. It's interesting because you have very old ways of thinking that in economies that are not based on cash but on capital, because livestock there is capital. So they are very conservative in selling the animals, whereas you have younger people that are very cash based, and they do crazy things in the eyes of the old people. They sell all animals when the prices are good, and they buy animals when the prices are very low. And it's like, what are you doing? And these are the guys that are doing best, and that are the elder of the village with 35 years, because they have more cattle than than anyone with this crazy strategy. So maybe with financial training and you would achieve much better production in the livestock system, and just implementing these innovations, but then you would be much more willing to listen to what is happening in the field, which it's not what I have seen in my work experience.
Great. Well, I think we have time for one more question, and it's a hard one, and I'm going to give it to Helena, but feel free to chip in, everyone. There's a question that came through as, how can trade regulation in the context of international beef supply chains be used as a lever to promote sustainable beef consumption? And if you want to pass on that and someone else wants to take it up, it's a hard one.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch on it. I think one of the really interesting developments that's happening and people have been following is this deforestation risk in supply chains. And the EU's obviously looking to bring in a regulation to prevent imported deforestation. And then the UK is sort of discussing that as well. So that's kind of a way in which, trade regulations can be used to address these kind of systemic issues. Obviously, they have implications for the finance sector as well when these new rules come in as well. So we're just tracking that to see what happens as well. But it's quite interesting to see this now, is being in the debate, and that will probably force change in terms of the companies needing to look at deforestation where they haven't looked at it before. Particularly, obviously, some of these products which Pablo mentioned before are causing a lot of deforestation, such as imported soy feed, etc., animal feed, and other products which cause a large amount of deforestation. So that's one area. And another area, is obviously linked to the area of trade, would be agricultural subsidy reform, which we've already discussed, but how that could actually promote sustainability and long-term sustainability of the sector. And also other ways in which kind of trade rules can be used to prevent sort of importation of high-risk products as well.
Great. Well, look, we are out of time. There's many more questions. I would also say that we have the table website, tabledebates.org, has a community platform. So please do post your further questions and comments there. And I will also try and twist our panelists' arms to see maybe if they might have a go at answering some of them if they felt so inclined. So I just want to thank our speakers a great deal, and for a really interesting conversation, especially in light of all those technical difficulties at the beginning. And I must also remember to remind everyone listening, and thank you very much to the audience for listening and for submitting your questions, that there is another event this time next week, that's the 3rd, which is Tim Palmer and Charles Godfrey in conversation on the topic of modelling climate change, predicting the future. So please listen in on that. So that's, I think, it for now. We're out of time. Thank you very much to all our speakers and to the audience, and a recording will be available in due course. So good night.